All right, guys. Sorry, let me pull up my notes here. Today we are going to talk about biological rhythms in plants. So what's left in this unit? We've talked about mainly all the plant parts that you need to know. So you know a lot to be able to go out and take pictures for your plant portfolio. So what we really have left in this unit is kind of how plants behave. And so that's what you're going to see in notes today. It's kind of cool. If you've never learned about biological rhythms in plants, I think it's something kind of interesting. Maybe you'll dig it. Get it? Dig it? Okay. So what are you seeing in this picture? It says, many legumes, such as this bean plant, lower their leaves in the evening and raise them in the morning. Now, in this particular experiment, this plant was kept in constant darkness, but the movements continued. So in other words, the bean plant would raise the leaves in the morning and lower them in the evening, even though the plant was kept in constant darkness. So we can't say that it was the sunlight that was a cue to have the leaf movements occur. So this is going to suggest some sort of internal biological clock. So you've heard that term circadian rhythm before. Circadian means around a day. We're kind of talking about that here today, but with plants. Okay, so let's remind ourselves what circadian rhythms are. I believe that's a TED Talk. I can post that for you in a little bit. Okay, so remember, circadian, circa is around, dia is day. So circadian means around a day. It is an internal biological clock of about 24 hours. It is endogenous, which means it's internal. This clock operates with or without external cues such as sunrise and sunset. So if the cue had only been sunrise, that bean plant wouldn't have raised and lowered its leaves. But the fact that we saw it raise and lower its leaves, even in complete darkness, means there's got to be something else going on. So, the light-dark cycle of the day provides cues that keeps an organism's biological clock in tune with the outside world. And that's just allowing you to run on more of a 24-hour clock as opposed to a 26-hour clock. That circadian rhythm is also important in plants for influencing seasonal events rather than just daily events, which could be something like, when the flowers bloom. And if I go too fast, just pause the video. So this multiple choice I thought was cool. It says the prayer plant Maranta leucanura folds up its leaves each night in accordance with a circadian rhythm. If we were to ship this plant halfway around the world to a location where it is daytime there when it is night here, the plant will. And the correct answer is slowly adjust to synchronize with the new day-night cycle. Think about if this question weren't even about a plant. What if it was about you as a human? What would you do? Well, if you've ever traveled between time zones, you know that it can take a few days to kind of match your body up to the new time zone and be on a new schedule. So the plant is going to do the same thing. Okay, so today we are specifically talking about photoperiods and tropisms. Okay, so two important, really behavioral aspects of plants. So photoperiod is the length of day relative to the length of night. So how many hours of continuous light there is versus how many hours of continuous darkness or uninterrupted darkness. So this is an environmental stimulus that plants use to detect what time of year it is. Now, not all plants have flowering that is triggered by photoperiod, but many of them do. So some plants, what we're saying here in this third bullet, is that some plants may have their flowering triggered by some other factor. They may have to survive a long winter before they can flower. But there are many species of plants whose flowering is triggered by photoperiod. So they fall underneath two categories. Short day, which are also called long night plants. Long day, which are short night plants. So think about how, we set our clocks forward a few weeks ago. And so our days have become longer and our nights have become shorter. So the types of flowers that you're seeing grow outside are probably those that are long day, short night plants. Okay. If it is something like a chrysanthemum, okay, a mum that you typically have in the fall, okay, those tend to be short day, long night plants. Okay, they don't usually flower until the day gets shorter and the night gets longer. All right, so to me, the big thing with this is that when you see short day plants, that you automatically think long night. Because they might be called short day, they might be called long night. Make sure you know that those are both the same thing. So these are going to generally flower in late summer, fall, or winter. I wouldn't say summer is that common. I would say fall and winter when you have shorter periods of light. So a classic example of a plant that does this is a chrysanthemum, like you just probably call them mums, which you'll see, I think, on the bottom of this slide, and then poinsettias. Okay, so there's a mum right there. These are mums. You usually plant those in the fall. So short day plants are also called long night plants. So scientists figured out in the 1940s that flowering and other responses are actually controlled by night length, not day length. In other words, the number of continuous hours of darkness, not the number of continuous hours of sunlight. The number of continuous hours of darkness is what makes a difference here. Okay, so let's look at these diagrams. Because you got to be able to interpret these. All right, so what this is showing you is this is the amount of light, this is the amount of dark, and for it to be a long night plant, in order to flower, it has to have more than this critical period of dark. Okay. So notice that this plant here does not flower because it is not receiving more than this critical length of dark. Okay, this plant is going to flower because it received more than that critical length of dark. Okay, so we are just captioning each of these pictures. So here we don't see any flowers, so we'll say that flowering doesn't occur unless the plant is exposed to a dark period of the critical length, at least the critical length, which for most of your long night plants is going to be about 10 hours. So notice here, this plant was not exposed to 10 hours of continuous darkness, so it did not flower. All right, in this plant, flowering did occur because the plant was exposed to at least 10 hours of continuous darkness. So the amount of darkness from here to there is the minimum amount that that plant needs in order to flower. It got more than that, therefore the plant flowers. Okay, here, it's interesting here. We see that this plant does not flower. Well, why not? The bar of darkness goes past there. Well, it's because we broke it up with a flash of light. Okay, so it got this period of darkness, which was not greater than the critical length, And it got this period of darkness, which was not greater than the critical length either. So remember, it's not, okay, I can add up this period and that period. It is the number of continuous hours of darkness has got to be greater than this amount, which neither of those were. So that's why this plant did not flower. Okay, so in this third plant, there's no flowering because the continuity of darkness, neither of those little segments of darkness was longer than the critical length of dark. So, sometimes people ask, well, what if I do a flash of darkness during the light period? That doesn't matter. Remember I told you that scientists figured out that it was the number of hours of continuous darkness, not the number of hours of light, that controlled whether or not these plants flowered. Okay? So next we're going to talk about long day plants, which are also called short night plants. Okay? Long day plants are going to usually flower in late spring or early summer when there's more hours of day, kind of like now when our days are getting longer. And so spinach, lettuce, iris, many grains, many of your crops are going to be long day, short night plants. So the other name for long day is short night. So what I want us to look at, this is showing you an iris in this picture, and I want you to see how this is different than what we did for long night, short day plants. Okay? And again, it's not about just memorizing a diagram, it's understanding what it means to be a short night plant and what they require. So, here we see flowering, because in them, this is still, notice how this is bracketed, this is the critical night length. But how this is different is that the critical length of darkness has to be less than this period, than this amount. And so here it is less than that amount, which is why this flowers. Okay? So flowering occurs when the night length is shorter than the critical length. Remember, for our other plants, for long night, the critical length of darkness had to be greater than that critical length, not less than. Here, because this is a short night plant, the number of hours of continuous darkness has to be less than our critical length. Here you see no flowering. The amount of darkness they had was greater than the critical night length. Therefore, you're not going to get any flowers. So here, no flowering, your night was too long. All right, here, once again, we do see flowering. Notice we broke up that long night with a flash of light. And because each of these segments had a length of darkness that was less than the critical length, that meant that these could flower. So notice here it says that flowering can be induced by a flash of light during the night. Now this is really useful for people who grow flowers commercially. Okay? Because let's say that somebody wanted a spring type flower or a summer flower in the winter. Well, all they'd have to do is, in order to get it to flower, or maybe it wouldn't be in the winter. Yeah, in the winter, because the nights would be too long, they could just do a flash of light in the middle of the night, break it up, and then you could get this to flower whenever you wanted to. So people say, well, what does the flash of light have to be? Could it be like lightning? I've looked this up, and apparently lightning is not enough. Well, you're talking about commercial growers here. So these plants are probably being grown inside or possibly in a greenhouse. And so they'd be able to control the amount of hours of light and dark pretty much however they wanted to. So the flash of light does have to be of a certain, I think I call them amperes. It has to be a certain intensity and a duration of at least a couple seconds, but lightning apparently is not enough. So why do we care? Florists use this information about short day plants to bring us flowers out of season. So chrysanthemums or mums normally bloom in autumn, but you could stall them blooming until spring by doing a flash of light in the middle of the night. Now, if that doesn't make sense to you, let's go back a few slides. Okay, chrysanthemums are long night plants, which means they've got to have at least that amount of darkness in order to flower. What if you didn't want them to flower in October or November? What if you wanted to postpone that blooming until maybe the following June? Well, then all you'd have to do is punctuate each night with a flash of light that breaks up that period of darkness, and now they will not flower. And so when you do want them to flower, just let it go past that critical length of dark. Okay, so chrysanthemums normally bloom in autumn, but their blooming can be stalled until spring by punctuating each long night with a flash of light. So what you've got to understand about what we're talking about here today, this is not just memorization. I'm going to post whatever video clips I think will be helpful. But you need to be able to apply this. You can tell probably as you're learning about this how I could ask you this. I could give you a scenario and say, hey, this is a long night plant. This is how many hours it gets. Here's the graph. Does it flower? You know, you've got to be able to apply that knowledge. You can't just memorize and have that be all. All right, day neutral plants. Day neutral plants have a different trigger. In other words, they are not stimulated to flower by the number of continuous hours of darkness. They are stimulated to flower by other things, like temperature or water, or even exposure to cold temps. So grains like wheat and rye need to be exposed to the cold during the winter, or else they will not flower the following spring or summer. All right, so let's talk about tropisms. Trop means turning. And we're going to talk about gravitropism and phototropism and thigmotropism, and they all have to do with the turning of a stem or root, a growth pattern. Okay? Okay, so we're going to talk about the three major types of tropisms. Okay, so like I said, tropism comes from the Greek root tropos, which means to turn. So the way I usually present this idea of tropisms is that, you know, one of the characteristics of living things is that they can respond to their environment. Okay, if a plant doesn't like where they're growing, they can't just get up and move. They have to make the best of the situation. Okay, so when I'm out on my walk today, I try and take a walk every afternoon. I'll try and take a picture of a tropism for you so that you kind of know what you're looking for. But I bet you could find examples of this out, in nature. So plants use tropisms to respond to their environment since they can't really change where they're growing. And so that's what this is saying here. If plants start to grow in an unfavorable location, they can't just get up and move. But what they can do is alter their growth pattern to make the best of the situation that they've got. So the three major tropisms that we'll be talking about today are phototropism, which remember photo means light, gravitropism or geotropism, which has to do with the pull of gravity, and then thigmotropism, which has to do with touch, not so much human touch. It's not like they're going to retract away, but that has to do with when you see tendrils wrapping around a stake or a fence. That's thigmotropism. And so they're going to have a mechanism in common. Okay, so I'm going to go through the mechanism with you and how plant hormones play a role in that. All right. So hopefully you kind of noticed this. I know we haven't been in school in a little bit, but if you remember how your plants looked when they were growing in the windowsill of lab, they were growing towards the light. We don't say that they bend towards the light because that makes it sound temporary. This is them actually growing towards the light, and it's typically when the light is only coming from one direction. So that's why in lab is usually dark. Okay, so the light is only coming from the window, which is why you see them growing in that one direction. The reason you don't see phototropism out in nature is because the sun is constantly changing position in the sky, so the light is coming from many different angles. Okay, so we're going to go through the mechanism, and this will be the same sort of mechanism for how the other tropisms work as well. So cells on the darker side of the stem elongate faster than those on the brighter side. What causes them to do this? That hormone auxin. Okay, so we'll learn about plant hormones. I want to say that that's probably Friday. That's a pretty big day. Auxin collects on the shady side. So notice the picture here. When the sun is high up in the sky, the auxin's going to connect at the tip and the plant is going to go straight upward. Okay? When the sun is mainly on one side, the auxin goes to the shadier side of the stem, and that auxin triggers those cells to elongate more, which is going to make that stem grow towards the sun. Okay? So remember, the collection of auxin causes these cells to elongate faster than these, which makes the stem bend and grow towards the sun in this direction. Here, when the sun is directly overhead, notice that the auxin molecules are pretty much equally distributed on both sides. So that's why you don't see the stem bending in one direction versus another. Okay? So the auxin collects on the shadier side of the stem and causes cells there to elongate faster than those on the sunnier side of the stem. Okay, so then we want to think about what's happening on a cellular level. Okay, auxin is going to stimulate proteins that pump hydrogen ions into the cell wall. And so the increased hydrogen ion concentration activates enzymes that will break some of the hydrogen bonds in cellulose. Because remember, we want the cell is going to elongate. Okay, so when you have more H pluses there, that's going to cause some of the hydrogen bonds to break, and then the cell is going to swell with water and elongate, and then that will cause the stem or the shoot to grow towards the light. So notice here in the picture, auxin stimulates H pluses to be pumped into the cell wall. Okay, the cellulose loosens, which just means you're breaking some of the hydrogen bonds there. The cell can elongate because it swells with water, and that's going to allow the stem or the shoot to grow towards the light. All right, the next kind of tropism that we're going to look at is gravitropism, and this is a plant's growth response to the Earth's gravitational pull. So when you plant a seed in the soil, you know, from that seed will emerge an embryonic stem and an embryonic root. Okay? And so you might wonder how the stem knows to grow upward and the root knows to grow downward. And so that has to do with gravitropism. And so that's what the second bullet says. When you plant a seed in the soil, how do the shoots know to grow upward and the roots know to grow downward? And the answer is gravitropism. So, get rid of my arrows there. What you're looking at is a little seedling here that is starting to germinate. That means the embryo is starting to grow and grow out of the seed coat. And tomorrow we're going to talk about the steps of seed germination and the hormones that are involved in that process. So basically, let's say you put a seed in the soil and we know that the shoots will start growing upward and the roots will start growing downward. Well, then what if you turn this seed on its side like you see here? So these would be the shoots and these would be the roots. Well, what we see happen because of gravitropism is we see the shoots start to grow upward and the roots start to grow downward. So we can't get rid of this part that's straight here. That's not going to go away. It's just any new growth that they have will be oriented downward, and any new growth that the shoot has will be oriented upward. Okay, now where you'll see this, so out in nature, sometimes you'll see a potted plant that maybe was turned on its side, and now it's sort of righted itself, and it's starting to grow up away from the center of the earth. That is gravitropism. Now, like phototropism, gravitropism also relies on the distribution of auxin. So, when you think about that little seedling that started to germinate and then we turned it on its side, auxin will collect on the bottom side of the root. Now, auxin has a different effect on roots than it does on shoots, like we saw with phototropism. In roots, auxin tends to cause this part where it collects to elongate less than where there's less auxin. So it's the opposite of what happens in shoots. So here we have a lot of auxin on the bottom side, and it will slow the process of elongation. Here on the top side, there is less auxin. That will cause the cells to elongate more, but notice what you still get. You still get that characteristic bend as it grows. Okay, in shoots, you know, stems, the opposite thing happens. So auxin will collect on the bottom just due to gravitational pull, and that will cause more elongation. So in stems, where there's more auxin, there will be more elongation. And where there's less auxin, there will be less elongation, and that's what's going to cause the stem to grow upward. And then finally, we have thigmotropism. This is a plant's growth response to touch. So remember, we talked about modified leaves called tendrils, and how tendrils we see in certain plants, and they wrap around a stick or a stake or a fence post. And again, if you think about the curve with this is, you know, attached to a stem, so the auxin will collect on the side that is away from the post or support, and that will cause more elongation on that side, which will cause it to bend around. Let's say this is the fence post. This is going to cause it to wrap around there. So that is thigmotropism, a growth response to touch. So I will take a look through here and see what animations or what videos would be most helpful to post for you. I am not making a new quiz today. Your next quiz will be posted tomorrow. And it will be about, the quiz tomorrow will be about secondary growth in stems. So your vascular cambium, your cork cambium, all that. Please make sure you do the review sheet for that, where it has you label parts of a monocot stem, monocot root, dicot stem, dicot root. So I'm not going to post a new quiz today. Your next quiz will be posted tomorrow. All right, guys, I'll see you soon.